Hi, I'm Bill Delane. Thank you for joining us today here on NHTV2. We're going to talk with Mark Trojanowski, who is the chairman of the Inland Wetlands Commission here in North Haven. Mark, thank you for joining us today.
Bill, thank you for having me. I enjoyed talking about this topic. I enjoyed our first conversation a couple of years ago, and I think we've got some important things to talk about.
We talked about procedures before and how your board makes decisions, hear cases, and so forth, things that any board would do. But today we're going to talk about property owners' responsibilities for wetlands that they have. Am I correct?
Yes, and I think it's an important topic. As you said, the last time we talked about the application process, the regulations, the procedures, working with our commission for an application. But today, I think the topic of talking about property owners' responsibilities, as well as adjacent property owners' responsibility, is very, very important, because what we've seen in this town and other towns have seen is violations of wetlands, and they're just problematic. We need to have people understand their responsibilities, how to deal with those situations, and perhaps even just basically how to identify those kinds of issues.
Now, how does somebody know that they have a responsibility for wetlands on their property? And maybe I should also ask, how do they know they have wetlands in the first place?
That's actually a great starting point. A lot of people, as you pointed out last time, sometimes move from the city to a smaller town like North Haven and never hear of a wetland. And what sometimes we hear is people come out here, they see an area that is wet, and they assume it technically falls under the definition of a wetland. And in fact, often that's not the case. A wetland in the state of Connecticut is defined very specifically by regulations, and those regulations specify a certain soil type. And technically, only a soil scientist could determine whether or not the soils that are present in your property or another area are wetland soils. A starting point, I might say, is that if you suspect wetlands, whether you've got poorly drained soils, you've got just an accumulation of water, perhaps a water course, the first place to go is the town. The town does keep a wetland map, and we try to update that as often as we can when an applicant comes before us and they want to do some sort of construction on a site. We have them update that map, and over the years I think we've done a good job, so that's a good starting point. But then even some wetlands aren't on that particular map.
Oh, okay, because I've looked at the map because I had wetlands. I had a water course, you said, right? I had a little stream that's called the water course. We'll get into that in a minute. But I knew I had wetlands, and I went and looked at the map, and I just assumed that it was etched in stone. It's not.
No. The map was first started with aerial photography when the regulations were passed by the state legislature back in, I believe it was in the 1970s. And that was only a starting point. Aerial photography only gave so much detail in terms of wetlands. The future updates were dependent on property owners and people that wanted to do work in wetlands, and we require them to update the map. Now, we've taken it a step further, Bill, and I think it's important to point out. A couple of years ago, the town implemented a process where when we've approved an application, or if a property owner has wetlands, they can mark the wetlands. We do require this of new applicants now, and if you don't mind, I'll show you exactly what we're doing.
Why don't you show that in camera 3?
Yes.
If you can just lift that up. Individuals
that are now working in a wetland area, upon completion of their project, we ask them to put these placards on 4x4 posts approximately between 50.
Oh, I've seen that.
Yes.
Okay, it's I've seen that on a development area that's maybe like only 7 years old. Okay.
Exactly. And we ask the property owners to put these between 50 and 75 feet apart, and approximately 50 feet away from the wetlands. And it just provides additional assurance, not guaranteed, that others that are getting onto that property or future property owners will understand that a wetland does lie there and that they need to respect that wetland.
Now, when you say respect that wetland, what do they have to do?
So that's a great question. Ultimately, the individuals that own the wetlands or the property in which those wetlands are on are responsible for maintaining and protecting the wetlands. And what does that mean? That means protecting them from things like filling, from perhaps putting a pool, a shed, mowing in a wetlands, clear cutting, disturbing them in any way, shape, or form.
You can't mow in wetlands? You can't mow your grass?
You cannot mow a soil or a wetland soil.
I did not know that. So that sort of limits you and your property value. Am I correct? Or
It does impose responsibilities, and I think a way to look at it is that there are certain limitations that are created. But there's a great many limitations, whether they be zoning limitations, other property owner responsibilities. I think what it does more than limits you, it creates a situation where you are protecting a habitat, a very environmentally sensitive but yet very important area or property that you own.
Now, what is the harm if somebody does mow on that area? Does that mean wildlife can't be there, or does it affect aquifers going into the water system?
Yes. Overall, it creates a situation where you're losing the overall integrity of the wetland. Let me just go over very briefly some of the important reasons why we have and maintain wetlands. Wetlands, and this is, I think, important to talk about, especially after the storm that we just had.
By the way, we're taping this on October 31st after Storm Sandy.
Storm Sandy. Wetlands, one of the first things that they do is actually they prevent flooding. And they prevent flooding by holding back or retaining certain waters in certain locations. So instead of creating a downstream flood, wetlands do a very important task of retaining and holding the water back. Also, if you have a well or in any way, whether here or elsewhere in the state of Connecticut, depend on well water, wetlands offer a purification device. Any water that goes through a wetlands is cleansed. The wetlands holds back various kinds of debris, various kinds of bacteria, and so forth. So it provides that. It does, as you talked about in terms of a natural wildlife habitat, it also provides that. So there are many animals depend on a wetlands. Deer, various bird species, aquatic and other mammal life depend on wetlands. The last, and I think it goes back to what we first started to talk about, is that it provides aesthetic qualities and aesthetic beauty that I think a lot of people actually like to buy a piece of property that contains wetlands so they can enjoy that aesthetic beauty.
This would be good for somebody who likes to have bird cage. Am I saying it correctly? Bird cages, bird feeders. Bird feeders. There we are. Does this help?
I think it does, and I think that it adds quite a bit to the surrounding areas, to a wetland, to have bird feeders, because you have the natural habitat there. I'm not trying to encourage people to feed any kind of wildlife that should not be fed, but certainly I think a bird feeder, bird cage adjacent to the wetlands is a nice addition.
Now, with these wetlands, if you have wetlands on your property, how far away can you build from the wetlands? Or maybe I should say, what is the restriction? How far can you not build towards the wetlands?
We in the town of North Haven don't have a hard and set limit on how far from wetlands you need to be to do any kind of activity. It's really decided very much on a case-by-case basis. However, we have a very important guideline, and this guideline actually is a guideline that creates a regulated activity, and that regulated activity is 50 feet away from a wetlands. So if you want to do anything in that particular area, the Inland Wetlands Commission would have to approve that particular activity. There's instances where we've approved activity within 5 feet of an actual wetlands. That means going 45 feet into the buffer area. And in certain areas where we've deemed the quality of that buffer to be so important in terms of whether it be additional habitat life or in terms of runoff or that it creates a danger to be on. For example, the slope may be such that the grade would allow runoff to contaminate a wetlands. We usually encourage the applicants to stay away from that buffer area.
Okay. Because I know I owned a home at one time that had the water course, and somebody who wanted to buy the house wanted to expand the house, and he and my agent went to town hall, to the land use office. Am I correct?
Yes.
A land use office, and looked at the map and said, no can do. That's what I learned, that little stream was part of wetlands, and I did not know that at that time.
I think this is an interesting opportunity to segue into the issues that we actually see in wetlands. In your particular situation, I think there was the good fortune that everybody had it within them to approach the land use office in the town and ask them.
This person was a builder.
A builder.
So, of course, he was educated with this, and I wasn't educated with this. I got an education out of this. Had it been somebody who was not a builder who said, oh, I'm going to expand the house, I'm going to expand it right on top of the water course, that would have been in violation.
Yes.
Whereas this guy knew enough not to be in violation.
Yes. Everything came together to do exactly what was right. We do find that kind of situation where somebody does purchase a piece of property, where perhaps only, in terms of the greatest amount of detail, the original property owner understands the wetlands and the issues. And the value of the wetlands or an understanding of where they actually lie in a property is not communicated to the new property owner. And that's where we actually see situations of violations that we hope that we can deal with kind of proactively, have people understand.
Have you or other people like you educated, what do you call them, building inspectors, property inspectors? If you're going to buy a house, you always bring in an inspector to look around the house, make sure you don't have termites and whatever. Are these inspectors educated in regards to wetlands?
Bill, that's a very good question. And I don't want to speculate, but in my experience in talking with inspectors, they often don't have a great deal of detailed knowledge. And what they do, which is the proper thing to do, is that they encourage the prospective property owner to contact the land use office in the town that they're looking at the property in and ask them for further guidance. And that town will most likely guide them to the town map, which shows wetlands, and sit down and talk with them a little bit about how to determine some of the basics that might warrant a concern about having a wetlands. And those things include a wet area, even though that by definition is not always a wetlands. Certain kinds of plant species are indicative of a wetlands, though don't guarantee it. If through your discussions you feel that it's necessary to hire a soil scientist, the town will help you. They won't give you an individual's name, but they'll guide you in where you can go for a soil scientist who will then definitively be able to tell you whether or not you have wetlands and further help you understand your responsibilities.
Can you find a soil scientist in the yellow pages under soil scientists or in yelp.com under soil?
I believe you can.
Okay.
I believe you can, yes.
Okay. My guest is Mark Trojanowski. He is the chairman of the Inland Wetlands Commission here in North Haven. We're talking about a property owner's responsibility for wetlands. Now, if you have questions about wetlands, we have a phone number to give you. We have it on the bottom of your screen. It's 203-239-5321. That's the main town hall number, extension 440. Who's going to answer the phone at the other end of that?
Well, we've got a number of phenomenal people that work as staff in the town hall. But the people that I think you're going to want to ask for and talk to include the land use administrator, Alan Fredrickson.
Okay.
Our town land use or zoning enforcement officer, Art Hausman, and then quite possibly our town engineer, and his name is Jonathan Bodwell.
Now, if I were to extend my property, let's say I owned a piece of property in North Haven. If I were to extend my property, of course I have to go through planning and zoning or get a building permit.
Yes.
If I weren't asking for a variance change, I would be going to asking for a building permit. If I go in to ask for a building permit, is somebody going to look to see if I'm possibly infringing on wetlands?
In the normal course of their duties, they will be looking at the diagrams or the plans that you've got, and they'll be able to, because of their training, see if there's wetlands on it that have been depicted on those plans. However, the problem lies, though, that some of the plans that you may be working with your builder, your architect, your engineer haven't been updated for the wetlands. So the town staff may have further knowledge by looking at the town map of wetlands to give you further insight. The next thing is that somebody from the town eventually will be looking on that site as you go through the process of building, and may further have the opportunity to be alerted to wetlands. But none of those are a guarantee. I think that we're looking for everybody to be vigilant and understanding what's going on and the potential for wetlands.
Now, again, I thought wetlands were already defined. If somebody is sitting at home and saying, gee, I don't know if I have wetlands or not, are you saying they should call town hall to find out? Call the land use office?
If they really have a concern and are suspicious because an area is wet, may contain things, again, this is not the determinant, but this is definitely a signal for potential of wetlands, skunk cabbage, which is very typical in a wetlands. Or they have a lot of deer, a lot of birds that congregate in a particular area, and they suspect because of the general wetness of the area, and if they want to know for sure, they should call the town, yes.
If they have a lawn that's mostly dry, they don't have to worry, right?
In most cases, that's not a major concern. Open fields, especially highly elevated fields, typically don't pose a problem.
Okay. So we're talking about an area that's mostly wet. They should investigate, they should call town hall, maybe get a soil scientist. But just because it's wet, it doesn't mean it is wetlands.
Correct, correct. Although rivers, even if they're intermittent, or any other water courses, sometimes just created by drainage, and I'm sure a great many people have seen things like that, do create a regulated activity. And those are also monitored and regulated by the commission. So if you have a water course that's maybe only active, let's just say from the months of January to April, that is also considered a wetland area that is regulated. So that's an area that you wouldn't want to alter its course, you wouldn't want to fill or damage in any other way.
Now, let's say a lawn gets flooded, like during Storm Sandy. Let's say a lawn gets flooded, but gets flooded only during a weather event like that. Is that a sign of it being a wetland too?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
When we have massive storms like we just had with Sandy, there's going to be a lot of ponding, a lot of standing water, because the water can only seep into the ground at such a certain rate. So you're going to have that slow drainage process. So drainage, or the lack of the drainage, the water accumulating that you're going to see in massive storms like this, is typically not indicative of a wetland.
Now, your concern is violations. That's a main concern of yours, violations. What kind of violations have you been seeing in North Haven?
Great question. The typical violations that we see include the actual filling of a wetland or a buffer area. And when I say filling, it could be anything from a major activity of construction debris, it could be leaves, it could be grass clippings, it could be other debris that's accumulated, branches, types of debris that you'd find typically after a storm like this, small twigs, branches, leaves, that you're going to want to just put someplace, and some people put them into a wetland. That is a violation that's prohibited. That does create a problem for the wetlands. That decreases their quality. It decreases the ability of the wetlands to do what they're intended to do. There's other violations that we see that are fairly common. People will sometimes put a swimming pool into a buffer area or even into a wetlands, not knowing, or thinking that it's going to create a minimal disturbance. That is also a violation and treated very seriously. Another disturbance which can have very serious consequences is the construction or the installation of sheds for storage. And why is that such a significant concern for us? It's not so much the shed itself, but the kinds of contents that you'll ultimately have the property owner put in those sheds, and the kinds of things that were
toxic materials,
chemicals, pesticides, gasolines, oil that they may use around the house for the lawnmower. Those things that if they ever leak or accidentally spilled can cause serious harm to the particular wetlands. There's one other violation that we're seeing more and more of on some of the wetlands in town, and that's the use of all-terrain vehicles and even mountain bikes on some of the delicate wetlands. People think that sometimes that driving an all-terrain vehicle on an area that might be a little bit wet kind of creates a further enhancement to their pleasure of driving it because it's muddy, it kicks up mud, but they're creating tremendous damage that sometimes is almost unrepairable and further causes the problem of us not being able to look to anybody to repair that if we don't know who actually created that damage.
And that's been a major problem in town with Peters Rock.
Yes, there's numerous locations where we've had this situation.
Mm-hmm. It would seem to me common sense somebody would not want to put a pool on wetlands, because if you put a pool on wetlands, I know from experience water has to go someplace. Mm-hmm. Because where I used to be on the condo board, we redid a parking lot because water was coming here. Now it went someplace else.
Yes.
It's got to go someplace. Water has to go someplace. So common sense tells me not to put a swimming pool in wetlands because that water could end up in my basement.
That's very true. Mm-hmm. We've had a number of applicants that have come before us, and we've asked them in terms of what their technique was for backwashing. And
what do you mean by backwashing?
Many pool owners actually have to backwash. In other words, run the water out of the pool through their filter.
Okay.
And what happens is that a lot of that material, if they're near a wetlands, can end up in that wetlands. And we want to prevent that because that's filling, that's contaminants. So we don't want that in there. Now, you indicate that sometimes it's common sense, and I would agree with you that I think in most instances it is common sense. People moving from other locations, cities, often don't understand the implications of their wetlands or the importance of them or their responsibilities, and that's what I hope that today's viewers will have a better understanding of, and so therefore they may not give that pool a second thought. Some property owners are also restricted by the amount of space that they have, and when they think about the alternatives, should I put the pool in, should I not, they feel that something may exist in the back of their yard, they'll put the pool in there because they're constrained as far as space, they don't understand the wetlands implications, and they'll do it. So I would share your feelings, but I think the reality is somewhat otherwise.
I'm going to ask a little bit of a controversial question. Yeah. Where do you have the balance between personal responsibility and government interference? I could see somebody watching saying, "Oh, the government's telling me what to do again." Where do we have the balance on that?
Well, I think I can answer that a couple of different ways, but I think, especially in the town of North Haven, our commission has gone out of its way to make sure that we try to introduce a balance.
Okay.
We have perhaps less hard and fast rules that govern us than zoning, than planning and zoning and so forth. I mean, we've got very I don't want to say nebulous, but subjective rules that we have to consider. There's less objectivity in our decision process. And so therefore we try to be both reasonable, we try to balance the property owner's rights, their desire to enjoy the property. And I think that we've listened, we've heard, and I think we've accommodated situations with pools a lot more frequently than, for example, where I think most people will understand that I think that governments, if you want to call it either intervention with the Watercourse Act, to try to protect the wetlands is perhaps more meaningful and important when we talk about sheds. Again, when we think of what can be stored in the shed and the potential dangers.
My guest is Mark Trojanowski. He is the chairman of the Inland Wetlands Commission in North Haven. This is interesting stuff. This is new for me. Again, I thought all the maps were etched in stone about the wetlands, and I did not know that owners have responsibilities to determine if they have wetlands on their properties and
Yes.
to observe wetlands. If you have any questions about wetlands, you can call 203-239-5321. That's 203-239-5321, extension 440. Do people get to come to your meetings and ask questions too?
Yes, they do. Actually, our typical meetings include the applicant who's got a proposal for the commission to consider. And we have town people that attend. People from out of town can attend. And we typically, in most applications, have a public hearing portion which allow residents, property owners adjacent, and even people from out of town to either voice their concerns or to ask questions of the commission.
Do you encourage people to report violations if they think they see violations?
Bill, that's an excellent point to make. We do encourage that, and I think it's incredibly important to point out that as construction has taken place in the town, and then you have, in many instances, wetlands, watercourses that are no longer typically visible to town personnel, which means that as they perhaps go about their normal functions and drive down the street, and where maybe 10 years ago they would have been able to look off to their left or right and observe wetlands, today there's homes that are in the way. And a lot of the wetlands, a lot of the issues that could be of concern to us are hidden by the property, and so they're in the backyards. That makes it very, very difficult for the town personnel, for the commission, for myself to be able to notice these things and bring it to the town's attention. So in fact, we rely on people, adjacent property owners, people down the street that are aware of a wetlands, that are aware of filling, to notify the town and have the town investigate those situations.
Now, as far as education, have you discussed these issues with real estate agents in North Haven?
We have not on a one-to-one basis discussed these. I think that real estate agents, including the inspectors, have an understanding of the wetlands, and I think it's incumbent on them to do a little bit of research when they're looking at a property, when they're showing a property, to have some basic understanding. And they too, with their experience, if they suspect anything, should reach out to the town for further guidance.
Like I told you before, the agent I had was very sensitive about wetlands, and when the person asked, "Can I extend the house?" he took the person down to town hall to land use office.
Yes.
Anything else you'd like to discuss before we end here, Mark? About
No,
inland wetlands.
I very much appreciate again the opportunity to come back here, and this time we talked about the violations that we're seeing, which again could include anything from filling, and the filling could be anything from grass clippings to debris that you're going to encounter on your yards, from branches, twigs, leaves that you're going to be raking this time of year, as well as the potential for more significant contaminants because of sheds on wetlands, the riding of all-terrain vehicles, other kinds of bicycles and so forth. All these create a problem for the wetlands and require town enforcement.
Mark, thank you very much. Good to have you here, and thank you for watching.
Bill, thank you to be back.